asked if I needed an introduction, and I said no. I would tell you a little story instead about an introduction I received some years ago out in Denver, of all places. I was going to appear that night with, walking to Gatlinburg at the Tattered Cover Bookstore, a very fine bookstore in downtown Denver. And my publisher, in their infinite wisdom, saw fit to hook me up that day with an early morning radio talk show. And they were hoping it would drum up some business for the event that night. Well, I knew a thing about these early morning radio shows, and the only reason they exist is to keep the commuters awake on the way to work. And the disc jockeys, they might have an author on, but they certainly don't read the author's book. So I didn't want to do it, but when the publisher says jump in this area, you say how high. So I said okay, and I showed up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and we got started. And the disc jockey said that he had a writer from Vermont whom he was going to interview that morning, but rather than introducing him to his listening audience by name, he would simply read off a list of the titles of some of my books, and he was sure that everybody in the greater Denver listening area would know exactly who I was. Well, I had a sinking feeling. I knew nobody in the greater Denver area was going to have the faintest notion who I was just from a list of my titles. But he launched into this recitation, and they were certainly good books. The problem being, right, that I had not written any of them. My buddy up in Lincoln, Chris Bojalian, had written those books. So for once in my life, I thought I was thinking quickly. I thought I was. And my plan, as soon as he paused, was to say, I think that Chris Bojalian is coming here next week, and that must be his file, but I'm Howard Mosher, and I'm here to talk about, whatever, walking to Gatlinburg. And then we would be over that little awkward moment. But in my confusion, that is not what I said. What I said was, I think I'm Howard Mosher, and this guy had been waiting his entire career for an opportunity like this. He pounced. He said, "You think you're Howard Mosher? You mean you don't even know who you are?" And I will say only that was the good part of the interview, and it went very sharply downhill from that point forward. This is an advanced reading copy of my new book, God's Kingdom, which is a kind of sequel to the family story, the Kinnison family story in my 1989 novel, A Stranger in the Kingdom, although the story is entirely different, but same characters. And originally this was going to be the jacket illustration for the book, but when my editor took it to the sales conference, the sales staff gave it a big thumbs down. And I think they were right. They said, well, that's a very cliched illustration, just the couple of fall leaves drifting down. Take it back to the illustrator, and he can do better. And does somebody have a copy of the book I could borrow for just a second, please? Thank you. And I think in fact, the illustrator did a much better job the second time around. I have to say, this is the first book jacket, that I've ever really liked, and I do like this one very much. I would guess that this is these two figures represent the grandfather and his grandson Jimmy Kinnison, who are the main characters in the book. Thank you. But somebody said to me the other night at an event, well, doesn't the author have some input into what goes on the jacket? And I said, yes, if you're John Grisham or Stephen King. But if you're Howard Mosher from Irisburg, Vermont, you're very careful to select the battles that you think you may have a chance of winning, and the book jacket is not one of them. So I think I've disconnected myself, Chris. You want to connect me? I knew I was going to do that. Thank you. Okay. I may still be disconnected, but I will speak up. I thought I would read 3 short excerpts from the first chapter of God's Kingdom, which is called Blodgett, and is on one level a kind of a Vermont hunting story, and then on another level, perhaps not. And each of the chapters begins with a quotation from the Reverend Dr. Pliny Templeton's Ecclesiastical, Natural, Social, and Political History of Kingdom County. And the Reverend Dr. Pliny Templeton is a character very loosely based on Alexander Twilight, the first African-American college graduate who graduated from Middlebury College in, I think, 1823, and then came north to the Northeast Kingdom and built a wonderful 4-story granite academy that you could sit right down on the Middlebury campus, and you couldn't tell the difference between that and those beautiful early classroom buildings at the college. But I took a lot of liberties with Twilight's life. So Pliny Templeton says in his Ecclesiastical History, on the earliest maps of Vermont, the wilderness that would later become Kingdom County was referred to as territory but little known. The first settlers called it God's Kingdom in reference to its remoteness and extraordinary beauty. To this day, you will still occasionally hear the term God's Kingdom used to suggest the wild and unspoiled character of this last New England frontier. In those years in God's Kingdom, there was always a ridge runner. There was always one deer that was bigger, darker, and smarter, with 10 or more points on its antlers and a track 3 fingers wide and as deep as the snow was soft. Of course, there was more snow then. Back when editor James Kinnison was just Jimmy Kinnison, a boy who had not yet been blooded, it seemed that by Thanksgiving week at the latest, there was always a foot of fresh snow in the kingdom. The year Jim turned 14, they referred to the ridge runner as Jimmy's deer. That old boy has your name on him, Bub, Jim's older brother, Charlie, told him. It was as though Charlie and Jim's grandfather and namesake, James Kinnison II, and Jim's father, editor Charles Kinnison, had let the runner grow to a great size so that it would be there for Jim to hunt when he turned 14. This was the usual age for a boy to be blooded in the kingdom of that era. They left for camp on Thanksgiving Day after the big meal at the Kinnison family farmhouse. Heading up along the river toward the Canadian border in Charlie's pickup, Their gear was in the bed of the truck. The open-sighted 30-30 deer rifles that they favored in the dense wood on the mountain, their sleeping bags, an extra set of clothing. Go light. The lighter, the better, was Gramps' hunting motto. Gramp was already at the camp. Charlie and the editor and Jim would meet him there. As they bounced up the washboard road along the river toward the border, Charlie's empties rolled around on the towing chain under Jim's feet, clattering together like little glass duck pins. "My God, Charles, you ought to hoe out your rig once every decade or so," the editor said. "Why?" Charlie said. "I'm just going to give it to Jim when he turns 16. He can hoe it out then." The road ended in a brushy clearing beyond which the river widened into pond number 1. The camp boat, a former lumbering bateau painted dark green, sat upside down under a tarp in a stand of black spruce on the shore. They transferred their gear from the truck bed to the boat and started out across the open water. Charlie rowed, the editor sat in the squared-off stern, Jim sat facing backward in the bow. The surface of pond number 1 was calm and the same steel gray as their rifle barrels. Jim was excited by the prospect of hunting the ridge runner. He'd glimpsed it this past July when he and Gramp were fishing pond number 1 from Gramp's Old Town. They'd spotted the buck drinking from the pond near the collapsing logging dam across the outlet. Except for a white patch on its chest, it was as red in its summer coat as a Jersey cow, and its horns were in velvet. Jim counted 6 points on each side. The deer lifted its head and watched them for a moment as water slid off its dark muzzle into the pond. Then it made 2 long bounds and vanished into the woods. Gramp looked at Jim and nodded. That was all. But Jim knew that this was the ridge runner. Come hunting season, if he was smart enough to walk it down and shoot it, this was his deer. So I'll skip ahead to after supper when the guys are sitting around the wood stove at the camp, and Gramp says to Jimmy, "I noticed you reading the camp log before supper, Jim." "Yes, sir," Jim said. "They didn't shoot many deer up here in the early years, did they?" "There weren't many deer to shoot," Gramp said. "There were very few natural meadows for deer to graze in. Just unbroken woods when the first Kennison came here. That would have been your great-great-great-grandfather, Charles the First. He came here to hunt men, not deer." Gramp never hurried a story. After a pause, he said, "Charles Kennison the First was born in Scotland. He fought at Culloden with the Bonnie Prince in the uprising of 1745. After the battle, he fled to America and settled in Massachusetts. He first came to Vermont in 1759 with Robert Rogers' Rangers. They were on their way north to Canada on what they called a retaliatory raid against the St. Francis Indians." Gramp looked at Jim to make sure he was listening. The only sound in the camp was the low ticking of the fire in the Glenwood. 4 miles west of here, where the river empties into the big lake, Roger's advance scouts came across a small band of Memphremagog Abnakis drying salmon on wooden racks. The Rangers bided their time. Come nightfall, they formed a human chain, crossed the rapids, and crept up on the Indian encampment. According to Charles I, the Memphremagogs were holding high frolic around their campfires, dancing and celebrating. The Rangers caught them unawares and slaughtered every last man, woman, and child. Jim's father closed the camp journal. "That was a long time ago, Dad," he said. "It happened, and it was a terrible thing, but times have changed, thankfully." The editor gave Gramp a look. Jim couldn't read, but Gramp continued his story. Charles I reported Jimmy that some of the Rangers cut off the heads of the murdered Indians and played at 10 pins with them. Finally, Major Rogers made them stop. "Jesus, Dad," the editor said, "we don't know that for a fact. Jimmy doesn't need to hear that." Charlie winked at Jim. "I wondered what they used for pins," he said. "Who's telling this story, gentlemen, me or you?" Gramp said. "The story's over," the editor said. "It's pretty much the story of the settling of America. And thank Jesus, it's over." "Not quite," Gramp said. Some years later, Charles I returned here. He married a Memphremagog woman named Molly Molasses and became the first white settler in God's kingdom. He said he settled here to do penance for killing the Indians. If so, he could scarcely have picked a better purgatory, Jim's dad said. This was the end of the known world in those days. Territory but little known, they called it. Actually, Gramp said, Charles I built a trading post and a whiskey distillery at the mouth of the river and became quite wealthy. "That's a good way to do penance," Charlie said. "I wouldn't mind doing penance by getting rich." They all laughed, and Jim felt relieved because he did not like tension in the family, even when some of it was just joking. "What do you say, boys?" Gramp said, standing up. "If we're going to tumble out early tomorrow morning and get this boy blooded, we better tumble in now. Hop down, Jimmy. Time to bank the ashes." Jim jumped down off the woodbox lid, and Gramp got a chunk of yellow birch and put it in the Glenwood's firebox and raked coals and ashes over it. The burning birch bark gave off a wintergreen fragrance. Jim could still smell the sweet scent a few minutes later from the camp loft, where he lay in his sleeping bag in the darkness, waiting to fall asleep, waiting for morning to arrive. And now I'll skip over to the last excerpt I'm going to read, and I should explain first that when my wife Phyllis and I first moved up to the Northeast Kingdom right out of college in 1964, I did not know that it was sometimes possible for a hunter to walk down a deer. But several old-timers explained how this could be done, and one of my neighbors actually took me with him on a hunt and showed me. I've never done this myself, but I saw him do it. If you pick up a deer track early in the morning and follow that deer, sometimes all day long, sometimes, sleeping right out beside the track and then following the track again the next day, sometimes a hunter with good stamina can actually outwalk the deer and walk the deer down. And Gramp has been training Jim how to do this for for several years. And so the next morning, Jim gets up early, goes out, and he picks up the deer track, and he follows that deer all over the mountainside and up near the Canadian border and back behind the hunting camp. And then toward evening, he's pushing the deer fairly hard up the mountainside toward the summit, and that's where I'll pick up the story. On the edge of the tree line, just below the height of land, the deer had collapsed again in a miniature forest of ancient, wind-twisted spruce and fir trees no higher than Jim's knees. As he approached, it sprang up and went crashing through the snow, its tail flashing like a white flag waved in surrender. But the runner was not yet ready to give up. The mountaintop above the timberline was strewn with mossy boulders. The largest of these was the almost perfectly round balanced boulder, a huge glacial erratic. To Jim, it looked like a gigantic dark bowling ball. The runner was standing at the base of the great round boulder, its legs trembling from fear or exhaustion or both. In the westering sun, hazy through a film of crystalline snowflakes, the animal was as red as it had been in its summer coat when Jim and Gramp had come upon it drinking from the pond back in July. One of its antler points had been snapped off, probably in combat with another buck. The runner squatted and peed nervously, its legs shaking, as Jim slowly approached it. Jim raised his rifle. His hands on the stock and trigger guard were as steady as the granite outcropping on the mountaintop. His heartbeat seemed to slow as he thumbed off the safety. And I'm going to be very mean and stop reading right there. In order to get you to buy the book, of course. But if you can guess what happens next, you are much smarter than the clueless author from the Northeast Kingdom, because when I got to that point of the story, even when I was, into the, fifth or sixth draft, I still didn't really know what Jimmy Kennison was going to do up there. And somebody who had read the story, and I'm going to be careful not to give the ending away, but somebody who read the story said, well, why does Jim do what he does? And I thought for a minute, and for once in my life, I told the truth, and I said, I don't really know why he does what he does. He just, at that point, he had taken things over, and that's what he does. So I thought I would visit with you for 10 minutes about where fiction comes from. And, so I wrote that title of this little talk down on one of my yellow tablets. I still write on yellow legal tablets by longhand, and I don't know why I do that either. It keeps me going slowly. But so I wrote the title down, Where Does Fiction Come From? And it looked neat and intriguing to me, and that's when I realized that I had no idea in the world where fiction comes from. It comes from some combination of the writer's experiences and observations and reading background, and then all that gets filtered through your imagination in some mysterious way, and that's the best I can do. But being a story writer, I can tell you 3 stories that illustrate where some of my fiction has come from and how it's evolved. And to do that, I need to go back to my youth in not in Kingdom County, because I didn't grow up in Vermont, but over across Lake Champlain in upstate New York, in what they call the Snow Belt, just south of Lake Ontario, where they claim they get so much snow. They don't actually get any more than we get here in Vermont, and the winters are much shorter over there. But I was lucky as a kid because I got to spend a lot of time on my grandparents' little dairy farm. And oh my, that was a rundown place if there ever was one. You could have picked it up and set it down in the Northeast Kingdom and it would have fit right in with 100 other little rundown dairy farms. And my grandparents had no indoor plumbing or central heat or electricity in their house, but they had something better. With them, there lived an incredible assortment of aunts and uncles and great aunts and great uncles, and a great grandmother who would come here from Ireland alone when she was 14 years old. And my grandparents were so generous that they would take hobos right in off the road. And I remember one guy in particular who appeared during a blizzard and asked if he could stay overnight, and stayed on for 3 years. His name, so far as we knew, he had only one name, Bill, no last name. Or if he did, he never told us what it was. And Bill's function was to sit out in the kitchen near my grandfather and listen to my grandfather's stories. And everybody in that household had stories to tell. And so as a kid, spending my weekends and summer vacations there, I was very lucky because I was kind of the beneficiary of all of those wonderful family stories. And I can't remember a time that I didn't want to be a story writer. But I had no idea in the world how to go about doing it. So the first piece of advice that I got about writing fiction came from probably what I would have said would be the least likely source, and that was my 8th grade English teacher, Mrs. Erla Battle Axe, as we called her behind her back, Erla Battle Axe Armstrong. And Mrs. Armstrong had been brought in to restore order in this little 3-room country school that I attended. We were rascals, and we had driven out several other poor teachers, so we weren't going to drive out Mrs. Armstrong, because speaking of David Ortiz, she had biceps just like his, and I felt their full force more than once. But she restored order all right. And one day in class, when I was supposed to be starting my homework, and I was trying to write a little story, can't remember what it was about, she caught me and confiscated the story. And she looked at it and gave a kind of a sniff and said, "Mosher," she called us little kids by our last names like a drill sergeant, "Mosher, if you want to write stories, you've got to do 3 things. You have to read the classics, revise your work, and write about what you know. And you, my boy, have a long way to go in each of those departments." And she was absolutely right in both respects. You know, if you want to write, yes, read the classics, revise your work, write about what you know. And she was also right that I had a long way to go. It is a very, very long apprenticeship. And somehow she knew that. So years and years later, when I got ready to write Northern Borders, I think that maybe the story about the little boy who goes to live with his grandparents in the kingdom in the late 1940s, I needed a mean school teacher. And it took me 1 second to think of Erla Armstrong. At which point I did a very bad thing, which I have regretted, really, over the years. But when I thought of that character that I needed, the mean teacher, I just couldn't think of her as anybody else but Erla Armstrong. So she is, so far as I know, the only real person that I ever based a character on whose name I didn't change. And if you read Northern Borders, you will meet the battle axe. And she, I think, had long since gone to some celestial classroom to lord it over other rascals. And I don't think she left any descendants, but still, I shouldn't have done that, but I did. So the great irony is that in all the years since then, nobody has ever given me any better advice about writing fiction than read the classics, revise your work, write about what you know. So I owe Erla both an apology and Erla a thank you. That was good advice. So story number 2. When my high school and college girlfriend Phyllis and I were getting ready to graduate from Syracuse University, Phyllis was completing a degree in science education and knew she wanted to teach. And I had an English degree, and I thought that if I was going to write, I needed to find somewhere a blueprint that would show me how to write something that somebody other than Phyllis might want to read. And I thought that blueprint might be out there in graduate school. And by the way, was I ever wrong about that? But that was a misconception on my part. So we didn't have any money, but we thought maybe we could both teach for a couple of years. We could find a couple of high school teaching jobs and save a little bit of money, and then maybe both of us go on to graduate school. So we heard about a couple of jobs, science teaching job, an English teaching job in Orleans, Vermont, up in the Northeast Kingdom. And we didn't know where the Northeast Kingdom was. We didn't know what the Northeast Kingdom was, but we wangled an interview, and on the last day of April, 1964, we borrowed my grandparents' old Super 88 Oldsmobile, and we drove it from upstate New York to Orleans to interview for those jobs. Well, we arrived on a Saturday afternoon, kind of late in the afternoon, and the main street was perfectly empty except for two guys right out in the middle of the street conducting a fist fight. And I cannot believe I was ever this naive, but I was. I rolled down the window and I called out, "Excuse me, but could one of you gentlemen please tell us how to get to the local high school?" And the bigger of these two guys said, "We can do better than that. We can take you there." And uninvited, they piled into the back of Graham and Grant's old Olds, and those bozos got us lost all over the village of Orleans, down blind driveways, and we got lost over in the lumber yard of the Ethan Allen Furniture Factory. Finally, by sheer chance, they got us to the high school. And they got out of the car and headed off down the street, arm in arm, laughing and joking and having a high old time. And as I turned in to the school parking lot, Phyllis said, "Look back there." I did, and the two guys had resumed their fist fight in the middle of School Street. And Phyllis tapped me on the shoulder and she said, "Sweetie, welcome to the Northeast Kingdom." So the entire staff had departed from Orleans High School the year before. I don't know if it was a dispute over salaries, but they had all left, and the superintendent was desperate to find a couple of warm bodies and put into his classroom, and so miraculously we got the jobs. And in the fall, when we settled in Orleans, we hadn't been there for a month before I realized that through, again, just sheer luck, I had stumbled on a place that was a gold mine of stories that no writer had ever told before. I think Robert Frost spent maybe 1 month in the Northeast Kingdom back during the 1920s or 30s, and I believe, so far as I know, that he wrote just one poem that can be identified as being set in the kingdom. Other than that, no writer had ever touched any of this material, and it was, for me, like finding a treasure chest. So I wasn't, at 21 years old, ready to write those stories yet, at least not very well, but I was ready to hear them. And I was lucky again because many of the people in the kingdom of that era dated back to Prohibition and the Depression, and they had had hard scrabble, tough lives, but they had wonderful stories to tell from that era. So I want to tell you one. A couple of weeks after we arrived in Orleans, our landlady, who rented the upstairs of her house to us, invited us down for coffee and cake. And she told us this story. She said that during the Depression and Prohibition, so it probably would have been maybe very early 1930s, she and her husband owned a little farm up near the Canadian border. And like so many other farmers all across Vermont and well beyond, they were losing it. They just couldn't make enough from their milk check to pay the mortgage. So our landlady very reluctantly decided that she would put to use the only skill her father had ever taught her, and that was how to make moonshine whiskey. And by the way, I had the idea from the way she told this story that her father had been abusive, although she didn't come right out and say that. I think he was a bad guy. But he did teach her how to make terrific moonshine. So she set up a little still on the brook that ran through the farm, and every night after that she would go down to the brook and she would run off just enough of the moonshine to sell in Orleans and Newport and the surrounding communities and keep that farm going during those tough times. Well, one night as she was running off the moonshine by lantern light, she looked across the brook and she saw what she described as a pair of city shoes with a man wearing a city suit standing in them. And she knew who he had to be. He had to be a revenuer. So she said to him, "You can arrest me if you want to, but I want you to know that if you do, we're going to lose our farm." And she looked back at her still, and when she looked across the brook again, the guy was gone. He vanished into the woods. So she and her husband held on to the farm, and they continued to farm through the 30s and 40s, but sometime along in the early 1950s, her husband died very suddenly of a heart attack, and she kept that farm going for some years, but eventually it became too much for her, and she moved into the little house in the village of Orleans, where we would come and rent the upstairs apartment eventually. Well, a few years before we arrived, there was a knock at her door one night, and she recognized the guy standing there in the city shoes and the city suit. And she said to him, "Have you come to arrest me again?" And he said to her, "No, ma'am. This time I've come to marry you." And he did. And they're very happy together, just as she had been with her first husband. And the ex-revenuer did something nice, of course. She had always wanted to see the ocean and also to see a Red Sox game at Fenway Park. So, of course, he took her to do that. But a couple of years after they got married, he contracted a very aggressive form of cancer, and soon after that, he died. So when she finished the story, our landlady looked at us, and she smiled, and she'd had a tough life, but she had a kind smile, and I can see her eyes were kind. And she said, "Now, Howard and Phyllis, I don't want you to think I'm complaining. I have nothing to repine over, but I reckon I just ain't had good luck keeping my husbands alive." At that moment, I looked at Phyllis, and Phyllis looked at me, and we both knew that one way or another, I was going to write the stories of the Northeast Kingdom. Okay, story number 3. I plead, I guess, youthful ignorance, but I still thought that someplace out there was that template that was going to show me how to write a good story, a good novel. And I still thought graduate school had to be the place. So I heard about a good Master of Fine Arts program in fiction writing at, of all places, the University of California at Irvine. And much as Phyllis and I hated to leave the Northeast Kingdom, we decided it was now or never, and so out we went to sunny Southern California. And we hadn't been there a week before I realized that this was the worst mistake of my life. And I don't think that I could have quite put it into words at the time, but I can now. What I'd done was I'd cut myself right off from all that wonderful material right back there in the kingdom, and all those wonderful stories, before I understood the place or the people well enough to write about them. And so as for the blueprint, I guess the blueprint would be Mrs. Armstrong's classics, but there wasn't any blueprint in California, and so I was a duck out of water. And we had been there, I think, 8 days when Phyllis, who has always been a step or two ahead of her clueless writer husband, said, "Look, let's go for a ride and see if we can get some perspective on this situation," meaning my situation. And so we pointed the car in any old direction, and where did it wind up? But right at what to me, to this day, remains probably the most horrible place in these United States, and that would be downtown Los Angeles, right at the intersection of Hollywood and Vine. Did you ever look around for a place to catch a brook trout at the intersection of Hollywood and Vine? Forget it. And the traffic light was red. So I think if it had been green, we might not be having this conversation, but it was red. Well, a city telephone truck pulled up next to us, and all I can imagine is that the driver of that truck saw our green Vermont license plate, because he rolled his window down and he called out, "I'm from Vermont too, go back while you still can." So, you know, to me, at that moment, that was like a message directly from the muses up on Mount Olympus. And 4 days later, we're back in the kingdom. No MFA, no graduate school, no nothing. But there we were. And Phyllis found a science teaching job fairly soon, but there were no English teaching jobs available, and it was late September by then. The jobs had all been filled. However, I heard about a guy named Jake Blodgett. And Jake Blodgett still logged with horses up in the woods near the Canadian border. And somebody told me that he needed a helper. So I thought, well, now that is an experience that I wouldn't have teaching, Robert Frost to 10th graders. I better go see this guy. So I did. And it happened that this was a Sunday afternoon, and Jake was home. He lived in a shack up in the woods with his 22-year-old logging horse. And I knocked on the door, and Jake appeared. He's a big guy with probably maybe 70 years old, snowy hair, and just piercing eyes, which he fixed right on me. But I told him that I heard he needed a helper, and he said maybe, as if it were two words, maybe, what have you done for work before? And, a chill came over me, because I had a feeling this guy had not had good experiences with teachers. But that's all I'd ever done. I had to tell him I'd been a teacher. And he laughed, and he said, well, school teacher, that ain't going to help you up in the woods with me. How much would you want for pay? So I said, well, Mr. Blodgett, I've never done this kind of work before, but if you try me out for a few days, I'd be happy to have you pay me whatever I'm worth to you. And he said, school teacher, that would not be much. And he was absolutely right. In that assessment, it wasn't. But bless Jake's heart, he took me on. And I worked for the rest of that fall and on into the winter, right through January, for old Jake. And my job, as only Jake could put it, was to run the horse. So we're cutting mostly pulpwood. And Jake would fell these medium-sized spruce and fir trees and limb them out with his chainsaw. And then I would hitch the tree-length log on behind the whiffle tree and walk the horse down to the edge of the woods, take the log off, cut it up into 4-foot lengths that we called pulp sticks, and stack them up for the logging trucks to come in and get after the ground froze. And I'd go back up to the cutting where Jake was with the horse and pick up another hitch. Well, every time that fall that I turned my back on that logging horse, it would start to edge off toward Jake's shack down the foot of the hill. And Jake would say with great delight, school teacher, your horse is running off on you again. Go fetch him back. So off I would go after the horse. And as long as I walked, the horse would walk, keeping about maybe 50 feet between us. But if I started to trot to catch the horse would begin to amble. And if I ran, the horse would break into a kind of a galumphing gallop, and off that horse would go. And if I chased that guy down to Jake's shack once that fall, I did it a dozen times, always to Jake's vast amusement. However, over our lunches up in the woods, and after Jake and I became friends and began to hunt and fish together, he told me a lot of the stories that my first novel, the whiskey love or hate. There's no middle ground with disappearances. And then Jake became the inspiration and model for the logger Noel Lord in where the rivers flow north. And best of all, in 1972, when our son was born, of course, we named him Jake after Jake Blodgett. And those are three stories that just hint at the misspent life of the author from the Northeast Kingdom. And we've got 5 minutes if you have any questions about the writing life or anything else. Yes, ma'am.
I've always been curious about the character development where you have it like the Kinnisons sort of weaving their way through your books, and how do you think about who the character is going to be, their quirks and their personalities, so that they're consistent? Is there a lot of forethought in that, or do you just kind of get to know them as you're writing them and that kind of thing?
Well, both. The Kinnisons are based on, for the most part, on my own family. But they definitely, like Jimmy Kinnison in God's Kingdom, when he's got to make that decision about the deer, they really do seem to take on a certain life of their own as the story and they evolve. But I'll tell you how I came up with the Kinnisons. The most difficult book to write of my titles was hands down A Stranger in the Kingdom, which is also probably the book that's sold the best, although my personal favorite is to this day is Northern Borders. But A Stranger in the Kingdom is based on a terrible racist incident that took place just up the street from our house up in Irisburg, up in the Kingdom, back in 1968. A black minister from California moved to town. He wanted to get his kids out of Watts. Watts was burning down that summer, and he felt it wasn't safe for his family, so he moved to northern Vermont, and he had not been there for 2 weeks before some drunks rode by his house and fired a couple of shotgun blasts into the house. And this chair reminds me, some of the pellets from the shotgun actually landed in the back of the chair that the minister's wife was sitting in at the time. So, to make a long and sad story as short as I can, instead of, this sounds like something that would happen in Mississippi in the 1920s. It happened in the 60s in Vermont. Instead of investigating the shooters, and everybody knew who they were because they bragged about it in every bar in the Northeast Kingdom, but instead of investigating them, the state police, abetted by the then local newspaper editor and the then state's attorney, trumped up, of all things, adultery charges against the minister. And this was the first time, so far as I know, that adultery charges had been preferred in Vermont by anybody other than an aggrieved spouse in 100 years. And also this triggered a barrage of hateful, ugly, racist letters in not only the local paper in the Kingdom, but if you look at the old Vermont Sunday News, which was affiliated then with both the Free Press and the Manchester Union Leader, if you look at the Sunday News for the late summer of 1968, you will not believe the letters that were published in that newspaper. Well, anyway, you couldn't be a writer, and at the time we lived in Orleans, but soon after we moved to Irisburg, where we've been ever since, and you couldn't be a writer and live right down the street from where this had happened and not write about it. But do you think I could get the handle for that story? You know, I added a murder to it, but other than that, the story was right there for me to write. And I worked on it off and on for almost 20 years. And it seems to me now mainly on. I bet I put that book through 50 drafts, none of which really seemed to work. Some of the drafts were all right. There wasn't anything really wrong with them, but there wasn't anything really right with them either. I couldn't find the angle of approach. So, to your question, long-winded answer to a good question. One night, as I was batting my head against a brick wall trying to write that story, I wrote a new sentence, and it went something like, when I was a boy growing up in Kingdom County, my father and my older brother Charlie couldn't say 2 words to each other without getting into an argument. And something told me that I had the voice, that I wanted to tell that story, and so I continued in that vein for most of that night. And the next morning I realized what I had was 13-year-old Jimmy Kinnison's voice, and that was the key to that story. But almost immediately after that, within days, I realized that Jimmy was probably based more or less on me. His dad, Editor Kinnison, was based on my dad. His older brother Charlie was based on my best friend and fishing partner. His mom was based on my mom. And once I found that personal connection to the story, I was able to write A Stranger in the Kingdom. So I think that, and that was 2, 3, 4, my 4th book. So I think I was well into my writing. Mrs. Armstrong was right. You know, I still have a long ways to go with it. Somebody said to me the other night, Howard, I am just an aspiring writer. And I said, well, excuse me, but let me interrupt for a moment. So am I. I am still just an aspiring writer every time I go to my desk. But those Kinnisons have bailed me over the years. They have bailed me out of more trouble than I could begin to describe. Yes?
Where did the story, I forgot, it's the true story, the exploration of Louisiana truck. That is your book, where the kid takes off to watch his uncle. And it's the Lewis and Clark expedition. Don't tell me that's not your book.
Yeah, no, it is.
Where did it come from? I mean, it's so different getting out of Northeast Kingdom. I love the book.
Well, thank you. The question is, where did my book, The True Account, come from? And I should tell you, first of all, that there's not one true word in that account. The one piece of advice that Mrs. Armstrong gave me that may be proved best by the exceptions to it is write about what you know. Sometimes it's surprising what your imagination will take you to that you didn't know you knew. And that was true with The True Account. This is the book jacket, and it shows a guy dressed up like Don Quixote because that's who he thinks he is, although in fact he is an old Vermonter from the early 19th century. Well, our daughter lives in Nashville, and 10, 12 years ago, my wife and I went to visit her, and we took a little day trip down the Natchez Trace, and we just by sheer happenstance stumbled on Meriwether Lewis's grave on the Trace. And Lewis is thought by most historians to have committed suicide there not many years after he got back from the expedition. Some people think he was murdered, but I don't think that there's evidence to support that. Anyway, I didn't really know that part of his story, and I was troubled by it and moved by it, as were my wife and daughter. And I thought it'd be interesting to write a novel about those last years of Lewis's life. I've always been interested in the Lewis and Clark expedition. So I did, and it was like those early drafts of Stranger in the Kingdom. It didn't work out. And I showed it to my editor, and he found a polite way to say that to me, but he said, there's something there, don't give up on this. So, but it wasn't my kind of book to write. So I then invented a altogether made-up character based on the illegitimate son of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, who tags along with the Lewis and Clark expedition, and of course is a terrible pain in the neck the whole way to the Pacific and back again, and that took a year or two. And the editor said, "This is better," but he said, "You know, it doesn't feel quite right to me," and it didn't to me either. But then the editor bailed me out. He said, "You got a character this time in the story, an old nutty Vermonter from Kingdom County who's a kind of a trapper and a explorer, and he just appears in one scene with Lewis and Clark up in North Dakota. But could you bring him forward just a little bit?" And I said, "I think I can." And a year later, I went back to the editor with the true account, in which Meriwether Lewis is a very minor figure, the Jeffersonian kid is gone altogether, and Private True Teague Kennison, of course, who thinks he's Don Quixote from the Northeast Kingdom, undertakes to race Lewis and Clark to the Pacific. And the editor said, "You got it right, this works." So that wasn't as long a procedure as A Stranger in the Kingdom, but it was fairly long. Folks, I notice it's 5 after 8. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Thanks for the question. Thank you. It's a good question.